Hi, today we're going to be talking about hazardous chemicals in the workplace. My name is Michael Terry, I'm from Momentum Safety and Ergonomics, and this is the 5-Minute Safety Series. Okay, so when it comes to hazardous chemicals, obviously we need to identify those hazards in the first place. As per all our different hazard topics, one of our main things that we need to do is consult with our workers before we actually go too far into this. They know what's going on, they know the chemicals they use, and they'll be able to give us some really good information. We should also be looking at the label. That has some really good, clear information about what some of the hazards might be, but also the main source of information that we'll have for hazardous chemicals is that safety data sheet. The safety data sheet is the information manual or instruction manual on that particular chemical, and it has all the information that you might need to know what the different hazards might be. So when we look at the safety data sheet, we need to look at a few key points. One of the main things that we need to look at first up is to identify whether the chemical itself is actually hazardous or not. And this will be nice and clearly shown in the actual safety data sheet itself. So on screen here you can see we have an example of a safety data sheet, and this is the area here where you can look to see whether the chemical is actually hazardous or not. If it is not hazardous, we don't need to worry. If it is hazardous, then everything else we say from here on in is going to be really important. Okay, so the next thing we need to do if we identify a chemical as being hazardous is do a risk assessment on that chemical. There's really 3 different types of risk assessments we can do. We can do a very basic risk assessment, which is just going to be contained on the actual register of chemicals that we have. And we can have a look here and see an example of a really basic risk assessment where we've just basically listed the chemical out and given a bit of a score or rating to do with the risk level of that chemical. The next type of risk assessment that we can do is a generic risk assessment. So here we can bundle chemicals of different types into one category and risk assess them all together. This is a really handy way of getting a lot of risk assessments done on a bunch of different chemicals. For example, paints, they all have the same types of risk levels. The last one that we need to do is a detailed risk assessment. And this is done for any chemical where there is more information required, it's really quite a hazardous chemical, or if we don't have the adequate information to put straight into the register. So here's an example of a detailed risk assessment form that you might do for some of those more tricky chemicals. Okay, so we need to think about risk control now, and of course when we're controlling risk, the most important thing is that we use the hierarchy of control. So the hierarchy of control tells us that we should try and eliminate that chemical, or the hazard from that chemical, as our first option. Now, most of the time we can't eliminate the use of the chemical. Occasionally, yes, but mostly no. So we're going to have to go to step 2, which is substitute. So here we're saying that we need to look for better options as far as the chemical is concerned. So that might be a safer option for a cleaning chemical, for example. So we might be using a cleaning chemical that's quite hazardous, and we can look for another cleaning chemical which does the same job but is less hazardous. That's substitution. Engineering is our third option, and here we can look at some sort of physical change to the actual workplace. So it might be something like a delivery system where the chemical is contained and it's delivered in an enclosed system. And you can see a bit of an example of that here. Some of our administrative controls are going to be doing things like task rotation, where we make sure that the same worker is not always using the hazardous chemical all the time, and we share that exposure out between multiple workers, or simply training in the use of the chemical, so the right volumes, the right concentrations, those sorts of things are important. And finally, of course, we've got personal protective equipment. So this is going to be things like respiratory protective equipment, gloves, masks, goggles, those sorts of things to make sure that we reduce the exposure through that means. For chemicals, there is some specific workplace requirements that are part of the health and safety regulations. So one of those is that we do have a register for all the chemicals or all the hazardous chemicals that we have in the workplace. So the register is going to include the list of hazardous chemicals, where they're located, and as we saw before, we can do a little bit of a risk assessment and detail the control measures that we've got for those chemicals as well. We do need to make sure that we have safety data sheets for every chemical. These must be less than 5 years old according to the health and safety regulations. We also need to make sure that every hazardous chemical in the workplace is labelled. So this is going to be an appropriate label on the container to ensure that we're not getting different chemicals confused. We need to make sure that we train our workers where appropriate and that we use personal protective equipment where appropriate. There is also another couple of particular requirements when your hazardous chemicals exceed certain volumes, which include placarding, so this is a specific signage requirement, and manifest requirements as well. So you need to have a certain type of manifest for high volume hazardous chemicals. So there we go guys, that's a bit of a summary of how to manage hazardous chemicals in the workplace. The main takeaways from today's session are going to be that we must have those safety data sheets for all our hazardous chemicals, and that those safety data sheets must be contained on a hazardous chemicals register. After that, we just need to make sure we have appropriate controls in place, which are always going to be implemented using the hierarchy of controls. But if we are using controls such as training and personal protective equipment, they need to be really clearly documented, and we need to have systems in place to make sure that they're actually happening. Thanks for watching the 5-Minute Safety Series. If you felt like you got some value out of these videos, please click on the screen to see some of the other videos in the 5-Minute Safety Series, or otherwise feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel.